All right. Hi, everyone that's just joining us now. I'm just going to give some folks another minute to log on. All right. Well, let's see. My name is Gianna. I'm one of the reference librarians here at the Chelmsford Public Library. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Tonight for our Art on Thursdays program, we present Marie Cassat Company, the Women Impressionists. So through this program, let's see, the visual arts revolution that is Impressionism is too often only understood through the lens of the leading male practitioners, such as Monet, Renoir, and Degas. So through this presentation, Jane is hoping to answer the questions, how did the women Impressionists contribute to this novel style, and how did their work differ from their male counterparts? And then to introduce our presenter tonight, we have Jane Oneail. She's the founder of Culturally Curious, an arts education consulting firm specializing in art appreciation programs. She creates and delivers programs throughout New England and beyond. Oneail holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University. Born and raised in New Hampshire, she has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as the executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. And for more information, please visit iamculturallycurious.com. I'll be sure to add some of the resources and some info about Jane in the chat. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Jane.
Thank you so much, Gianna, and thank you everybody for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about Marie Cassatt and the Women Impressionists. I am honored that you're spending your evening with me, and these ladies, they will not disappoint. This is a really interesting period of art and some really fascinating artists. So these women Impressionists were working in an age of institutional exclusion when it came to women in the arts. There were no women who were exhibited in the halls of great museums like the Louvre in Paris, but of course, almost all of the nudes there were depictions of women. So it was a period where the balance of power was completely tilted against them. So how did these women break into the arts, and how did any of them make a name for themselves? Well, we'll be diving into all of this, of course. Let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll go through the material tonight. We will do a quick sort of refresher on French Impressionism, just so that we all have the basics at the forefront of our brains. And then we have four major artists to touch on. Marie Cassatt, I think, is familiar to most of us because she's an American artist. She's actually the only non-European artist to exhibit with the French Impressionists. The other ladies we'll be looking at were all living in Paris or in France during the period of French Impressionism. So we have Berthe Morisot, Eva Gonzalez, who's depicted here by the artist Monet. I love this image of a woman at work at her easel. I love that she's wearing a pristine white dress while she does it. It's just impossible to imagine that it doesn't get dirty. And then we'll look at Marie Bracquemond. So plenty to cover here. Let's dive right in to the basics of French Impressionism. We're going to get started with Edward Manet, and we can see him over here in a portrait from the late 1850s. Edward Manet was sort of a proto-impressionist. He was a lot of his revolutionary painting was happening in the 1860s, and it's really the 1870s which are like the heyday for French Impressionism, when it was widely practiced, and it had begun to become accepted as well. So Manet was doing the cutting edge stuff sort of early on, and we can see that with an image like this one over here. It's called Olympia, painted in 1863. Now, there's a lot to this painting. We could talk about it for the next hour, but we're going to talk about it in terms of what made it revolutionary for the time and how it relates to French Impressionism. So what we're looking at is obviously a depiction of a reclining female nude. And this was a subject, and Manet was very aware of this, that goes back centuries in the history of art. There are depictions of beautiful Venuses, like Titian's Venus over here from 1538, the Venus of Urbino. And this whole tradition of painting a reclining female nude, these were considered sort of naughty paintings for the time. If you had it up on your wall, you might have a curtain over it and you might just reveal it at certain times. But you'll notice that in the tradition of painting a reclining female nude, your nude model is sensual. She has a come hither look on her face, and she's got this sort of gently curved body and warm flesh. And Manet sort of, well, he defies all of those traditions with his Olympia over here. You'll notice that her flesh is not sort of golden colored. She doesn't have these nice curves to her figure. Instead, she looks kind of bony, a little bit angular, and the color of her flesh, well, people in Paris referred to it as looking corpse-like. But really, Manet situated this reclining female nude in the present day because this name Olympia really referred to a popular name for courtesans at the time. So he's taken the idea of a mythological goddess of love and turned her into a woman who is there for a financial transaction. And so you'll notice that the come hither stare is replaced by an all business expression on her face, and a hand that signifies sort of closed for business. Now, in terms of the way that this is painted, this is an important idea. There's sort of large passages here in terms of her flesh, and even with this white bedding, that look like essentially unmodulated color. So it's as though he's not adding in precise detail. It almost looked unfinished in some ways. And then beyond that, we have this really harsh contrast between the bright whites of the linens and her flesh and the dark backgrounds here. Even the black cat and the black woman in the background, in various reproductions of this work, it's almost impossible to see them. That's how stark that contrast can be. And people, they found it jarring. They really disliked it. So Manet gives us this new approach to painting. It wasn't widely accepted, but it ushers in some new ideas about painting with broad swaths of color, painting subjects in present day. And so very quickly, within a short period of time, you have artists like Claude Monet, who we see over here in a portrait from the late 1860s, and an example of his painting that's at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. This is a painting of his wife with a companion, and I absolutely love it because it's a great Impressionist painting, but I love this picture in particular because it almost looks like he just added some polka dots on top of this painting. And of course, what we're looking at is the play of light coming down through the leaves of the trees and the shrubberies around them. So we have this great, fantastic sense of the day and the quality of light and the time of the year here. So when it comes to French Impressionism, when full-blown French Impressionism, artists like Claude Monet are working rapidly. They're working outside, en plein air, as the French say, and they are they're not trying to create what would appear to be like a finished, polished painting with invisible brushstrokes, which was the norm prior to this revolution of French Impressionism. Instead, they're working to make their brushworks short, sort of staccato and visible, to give us this momentary effect of light and shadow. So of course, Claude Monet goes on to create these series of works that are so well known and so popular today, great examples of landscape painting. That's really where his heart was. So we have the haystacks over here on the left and the water lilies over here on the right. Now, he had several colleagues who were also French Impressionists, including Auguste Renoir, who we can see over here in a portrait from the late 1860s, and a great example of his painting style over here on the right. This is called The Swing, and with the swing, we can see some of the elements of Claude Monet's painting, this same interest in the momentary effects of light and shadow, the same quick broken brushstrokes, so we don't get this highly polished finished painting here. But Renoir was always much more interested in human interaction than Claude Monet was. Claude Monet was content to sit in a field and paint a haystack, but Renoir wanted to show us, well, he wanted to show us people engaging with each other. And I will say it, he was the master of the flirt. So I think we've got some hardcore flirting happening here with this swing. Now, continuing on with that idea of flirting and modern life, I'm going to introduce another concept here with another Renoir painting. This one's from the 1880s, and it's called The Umbrellas. So with this work by Renoir, we see Paris on a rainy day. There's this chaos of umbrellas. We're in some sort of crowded public square. People are moving all about, and it's a largely monochromatic work. And so our eyes go to particular faces with this painting, don't they? My eye typically starts over here with the woman in this beautiful dress, and she's looking backwards at her very well-dressed children. One of them is looking out at us. She kind of holds our gaze, and that expression is matched by this woman over here who is not as well dressed. And there's almost like a look of weariness on her face. Notice she doesn't have an umbrella. She's like the opposite of an umbrella. She's got a basket. She's just moving across this square trying to, finish some work, some job. But just behind her is a man, and he's sort of a dandy. He's got his top hat. He's very well dressed, and he just seems to be looking at all of these women. And it sort of creates this, almost this sense of vulnerability, especially in this woman here who doesn't have an umbrella. So this is a depiction of what the French called the flâneur. And the flâneur was a detached observer of modern life, always a man. And it was typically an upper class man who had the freedom to kind of wander around the city and just watch events unfold, take in the sights and sound, do all of the people watching as though they're almost watching theater. So it was a new kind of person in modern society. And like I said, always male. And I will say that there's a certain power and authority that comes along with being the person that is doing the looking. It's reminiscent of the fact that in art history, there is this implied male gaze. There's this sense that men have made all of the art, well, most of the art throughout the history of time, and primarily for male artists. So they've essentially focused in on things that men would like to gaze upon. So that is sort of the idea of the flâneur in a nutshell. And we'll see how women artists and women impressionists sort of come up against that idea of the flâneur. But the ultimate flâneur would be Edgar Degas. We can see him here in a self-portrait from the 1850s. We know him best for his depictions of ballerinas, oftentimes stretching or practicing or caught in a moment in a dress rehearsal like we see over here. But I wanted to share Degas in particular because he is an artist who made great use out of the fact that he was a man, and he had great freedom to wander around the city streets of Paris at all hours of the day to take in the sights and sounds. So he could go to these kind of raunchy stage performances that they had at cafe concerts. This is a performer at one of those shows. This is an image called Song of the Dog, where we see this woman who is not classically beautiful. Degas is not trying to honor her, really. He's trying to make her a little garish here because she's uplit by the stage lights, and she's sort of doing this little show here. And we can see some of the audience members in the background. Over here on the left, we see women on a cafe terrace, and this is believed to be a depiction of a group of courtesans. Now, just moving about Paris like this was within the realm of the male artist and within the realm of the flâneur, because women from an upper class background did not have that freedom. This would have destroyed their reputations. So artists like Mary Cassatt could never be out in Paris without companionship, or sometimes even with companionship, it would be scandalous for them to paint such an image. So Mary Cassatt and others were oftentimes relegated to the domestic sphere. They're not painting the cafe terraces, they're painting the tea times that were happening in upper middle class households. So we see a huge disparity in terms of the subject matter, and we'll see how they kind of press against those limitations in some ways, and how they create really fascinating images within those limitations. So let's fully turn our attention now to Mary Cassatt. All four of the artists that we're going to look at tonight were born in the 1840s, so they are all contemporaries. They all would have been, some of them knew each other very well, and they all would have been aware of each other. So Mary Cassatt, as I said, is our only American. Art historians, well, I should say museum curators don't quite know where to place her in museums. Sometimes she's in European galleries, sometimes she's in American galleries. For the most part, I think we like to claim her as an American. She was born in Pennsylvania, but she did spend most of her life in Europe. So she came from a very wealthy background. This is, of course, a photograph of her from, I believe it's 1867. This is a self-portrait from the 1880s. And you can just see the suggestion of the fact that she's working on a canvas or on a board right here. So she came from such a privileged background that she did not have to be an artist. She didn't have to be anything, but she was determined to become an artist. So she attended the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. They did accept women at that time, but women only represented about 20% of the student body, and they were certainly treated very differently. They couldn't do all the things that male students were doing. They certainly couldn't study live models. They were relegated to copying plaster casts a lot of the time. And Mary Cassatt just was so disappointed in that. So she, with this kind of wealth that her family had, was able to leave and go to Europe and travel around to all the great cities of Europe, eventually settle in Paris, where at an early age, in her early 20s, she was getting work accepted in the big annual state-sponsored exhibition, which was called the Salon. Now, this is a feather in any artist's cap, and she's able to do this as a woman in her early 20s, but she was frustrated with that process too. She felt like she needed some man to sort of bring her into the fold there, and without that, she felt like she had to kind of curry favor with the judges or kind of flirt with jurors in order to get her work appreciated. She disdained this process. So here she is living in Paris. We have a self-portrait of Mary Cassatt over here versus a self-portrait of Edgar Degas. And she is exposed to his artwork. She falls in love with his artwork. And then she meets him in 1877. And Degas becomes very fond of Mary Cassatt, and he invites her to exhibit with this group of independent artists that we now know of as the Impressionists. They only have 8 exhibitions, and Mary Cassatt exhibits with their final 4. So she comes a little bit late to the party, but she gets fully integrated into that group. And she said, "At last I could work with absolute independence without considering the opinion of a jury. I had already recognized who were my true masters, Monet, Courbet, and Degas. I hated conventional art. I began to live." I'm like getting so excited for you right now, Mary Cassatt. What happens next? Well, she and Edgar Degas start this platonic friendship, this artistic friendship that lasts the next 40 years. And these are 2 images that Degas created of Mary Cassatt, because they would go to the Louvre Museum and take in all of this work from the great masters. And this was something that Mary Cassatt couldn't do without a chaperone. It's pretty mind-blowing to think that you couldn't go to an art museum alone as a woman in the second half of the 19th century. So then we began to see Mary Cassatt sort of blossoming, using this new style, all of the influences of the Impressionist group. And whenever I look at this painting too, I always think of the influence of Japanese woodblock printing as well. So when we think of Mary Cassatt, we think of her as the artist that paints children and the artist that paints mothers with their children. And this is a classic example. This is Little Girl in a Blue Armchair from 1878. Now, Mary Cassatt herself never got married, and she never had any children of her own. And she recognized that she was giving up a lot in order to become an artist. She said, there's only one thing in life for a woman. It's to be a mother. A woman artist must be capable of making primary sacrifices. So she knew she was going to live an entirely different kind of life. Now, it was just about a decade ago that researchers at the National Gallery of Art studied this painting very closely under and they studied images of infrared sort of x-rays of this image. And they determined that there were passages of this painting that were completed by Edgar Degas. And I remember at first thinking, oh, how sweet. They were close friends. They collaborated. They worked on this painting together. But what we'll see throughout tonight is that it was actually not unusual for the male impressionists to alter the work of their female contemporaries. And this is something I've never heard of in the history of the art. I've never heard of men altering the work of their male contemporaries or women doing that to female contemporaries. I think it sort of represents this kind of uneven balance of power. So let me show you what Edgar Degas did when it comes to Little Girl in the Blue Armchair. This is a work that Mary Cassatt had originally composed where this interior space, the wall met, or the floor met the ceiling right here in a horizontal line that would have sort of cut through this little girl's head. Degas altered that to create this strong diagonal leading our eye back to the far corner of the room. And then Mary Cassatt moved the little puppy so that he's sleeping right alongside this little girl in this kind of unguarded pose there. So it's interesting to think about how that relationship between these two artists actually existed, and did she welcome this or was she frustrated? I can't think of any creative work that somebody feels very proud of and attached to where they would welcome somebody else just coming in and kind of making it their own. So we're continuing on with this thread that Mary Cassatt, as an upper middle class woman, would not have had the same kind of freedom as Edgar Degas. But there is a brief period in her artistic output where we see her going out quite a bit, actually. And she would go to the theater, she would go to the Paris Opera, and she could go because she had an older sister who was also unmarried, who served as her chaperone. Her older sister was 7 years older than her. Her name was Lydia. We see Lydia over here. This is a painting called Woman in a Pearl Necklace from 1879. I think of these images as so incredible and so unusual in Cassatt's body of work. So with this work, let me just get you oriented. Her sister Lydia is sitting in an opera box at the Paris Opera. And over here, we are inside the Paris Opera, standing on the stage. We can see there's all this floor seating. Those are the cheap seats. And if you had a good chunk of change to drop on your opera tickets, you would get a box seat. And you'll notice that this is a horseshoe-shaped theater, and there's several tiers of these opera boxes. So it's a semi-private space, but they also kind of functioned as their own little stages where people on the floor could watch what's happening with the people who were more wealthy, the people who had extravagant costumes on. That was a whole theater in and of itself. And that is where her sister Lydia is. And Lydia looks like she's having a great time, doesn't she? She is smiling. She's showing her teeth. She seems relaxed. And what's interesting about this painting is that because she's in the opera box, we know that there would have been a mirror behind her. So this is actually a reflection of her shoulder. Curiously, she's not wearing a pearl necklace in her reflection, but everything that is depicted as being behind her in the painting is actually out in front of her. So she is having fun sort of taking in the sights of the Paris Opera here. She is kind of playing the role of a male flaneur. In this case, the French have the female version of the word, the flaneuse. So she has the power of the male gaze here. And Mary Cassatt's most famous work of the Paris Opera is about just that subject here. And this work, we're so lucky because it's in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. This was painted in 1878. And what we see here looks like a very respectable woman at an afternoon production. She's wearing this kind of serious black dress. And at first glance, you might assume that she's probably watching the show, but I think her opera glasses are trained ever so slightly upwards. I have a feeling that she's checking out somebody else in their opera box in this moment, and she has every right to. That's what people are there to do. So she's given that, well, Mary Cassatt gives this woman agency in this moment, allows her to take on the power of the male gaze here. And she emphasizes that this is a painting all about the power of the male gaze, because the same balustrade that this woman is leaning on curves all the way back here. And there is a man in the background who's leaning on the same balustrade with his little opera glasses looking back at this woman. So it's about the power of the gaze here, and in this case, the agency that Mary Cassatt gives this young woman. So the classic art history 101 comparison here is between Renoir, who painted an opera box 4 years earlier, and Mary Cassatt here. Renoir paints this beautiful young woman as not a subject really, but an object. She is in this kind of state of paralysis, but she's lovely as ever, purely decorative. Really, she is a lovely subject for us to feast our eyes upon. And she's got the flowers and the pearls and the gold and this incredible dress, but she is doing nothing. She isn't even using these opera glasses, really. And her date over here is just the opposite. He is using the power of the male gaze. He is a flaneur, and he's very clearly checking out other people at the opera. Now, very sadly, we don't associate the opera with Mary Cassatt and her entire body of work for good reason, because within the space of just a few short years, Mary Cassatt's sister suddenly passes away in her sleep. And so it represents this enormous loss in the life of Mary Cassatt, because not only did she lose her sister, who was also unmarried and this kind of independent spirit. I think they really imagined like living these very free lives together, but her sister had been her chaperone. So Mary Cassatt lost her freedom. She lost her willing model, and she lost the friendship of her sister. And so with that, she kind of has to retreat, and she really is kind of stuck at home in a way that certainly artists like Edgar Degas were not. So we see her relegated to painting women and their children. This is the subject that is appropriate for a woman of her social standing. Now, these two images, of course, are not women at home, but these are such great images, I had to share them. And I think they're kind of revolutionary in their own way too. Both of them showing this influence of Japanese woodblock printing. And you can see, even though this sort of looks like a family grouping perhaps, or at least there is a male in this picture, Mary Cassatt is not as interested in him. She is showing us this woman and her baby in the rowboat here. And then over here in the print, she's interested in all of these patterns in the women's dresses as they feed the ducks with this little girl in the boat here. So for the most part, that's what she is painting. This is her subject, and she really can't get out beyond the domestic sphere, save for one huge commission that I think isn't discussed enough. So we have the World's Columbian Exhibition in 1893. This is in Chicago. It's like a World's Fair, but it's celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the New World. So it's a fair that's really designed to promote the achievements in industry, in art, and science, agriculture, all of these things. And it was the very first time women were asked to paint public art in America. And Mary Cassatt was one of those women. Now, what we're looking at here is what this temporary city was designed to look like. And it was, of course, designed to look like an ancient city, a neoclassical city, the very embodiment of democracy. And but instead of being, made out of marble or limestone, these are all temporary structures that came down right after the fair was over. Now, women didn't have a huge part in planning this fair, but the fair planners kind of threw the women a bone and let them have their own building that was designed by a female architect. So this is the women's building at the fair. And inside the Hall of Honor, which had a 70-foot high roof here, there were two paintings just underneath that roof on either end of the hall. One of those paintings was a depiction of primitive woman and all of the sort of toil and drudgery that women have historically had to deal with. And Mary Cassatt is asked to paint the picture opposite from primitive woman. She is asked to paint modern woman. So let's take a look at what she painted. And I'm sorry, this is a pretty grainy image. We're going to zoom in a little bit closer, and I do have some color images to help us out here. But what she gives us in this 60-foot long painting here, that I should mention she painted when she was almost 50 years old, is a triptych, a painting that's divided into 3 panels. And we're going to zoom in on this central panel, the most important. So this triptych format, I should mention too, is kind of a reference to religious painting from the past. And as we zoom in, that central panel is a depiction of women picking apples. And ding, your first association there might be the Garden of Eden, right? Eve picking an apple from the tree of knowledge. That's the original sin. So what is Mary Cassatt doing with this? Well, she gives us all of these modern day Eves, essentially, and they're all picking apples. They're all gaining knowledge here. There's no sign of Adam. There's no sign of the serpent here. This isn't about temptation. This is about women bettering themselves, advancing their own station and status here. This is what modern woman looks like to Mary Cassatt. What an incredible allegory for what modernism could be, referencing the history of our art here. Now, to understand the whole tympanum altogether, on the right, there's a little image of 3 girls who are chasing the figure of fame that's flying through the air over here. The girls grow up and they become essentially the embodiment of the arts. So they are art, music, and dancing over here. So all together, this tympanum is sort of about, childhood, young adulthood, and adulthood. So it's like these 3 ages of women here. And another big idea to keep in mind is that these women at the center who are plucking the fruit, gaining all this knowledge, they're essentially doing something that has been traditionally relegated to men. And so not everybody loved this painting. There were a fair amount of critics, including Mary Cassatt's friend, Edgar Degas, and several men that Mary Cassatt even knew who walked through this building. And they sort of said, so this is your idea of the modern woman. She doesn't engage with modern man. And Mary Cassatt had like the pithiest response. It was something like, I'm sure men are shown in all of their vigor in plenty of other buildings in this fair, so you can go see them elsewhere. But 200,000 women passed through this building and were inspired by these images, including several key suffragettes who would help to win the right to vote for women in the next century. So this is a hugely influential painting. Now, you're never going to believe what happened to it. I mentioned before, this was a temporary city that was built for this fair. It all came down, including Mary Cassatt's painting. This is the first public work by the most preeminent female artist in America. The painting was taken down and has since disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to it. Most people assume it's probably damaged or destroyed. There's some thinking that it might be in a library or something like that, somewhere within an hour or so of Chicago, but nobody has seen it since. So Mary Cassatt goes back to painting women and children. And we could spend a long time on these images. They're very sweet. Sometimes they feel like an update of the Madonna and Child. But I think what's so successful about them, I think what makes them special, is that these are not posed formal portraits. She gives us these intimate moments between mothers and their children that hadn't really been shown before in the history of art, or really created before. And so they're really endearing. And she continues making images like this right up until around 1910, when her eyesight begins to fail. And in the final years of her life, she plays a very important role where she's advising American collectors on which Impressionist artists they should collect. And she's also making them promise that they will donate these works of art to major American collections upon their death. So if you've ever seen a great Monet or Renoir in a museum in America, it's probably because of Marie Cassatt. She also really advocated for the right for women to vote. And right at the end of her life, she said, the time has finally come to show that women can do something. And of course, Marie Cassatt had been doing that all along, a pretty revolutionary woman. It's amazing to think that behind all of those sweet scenes of domesticity, there was this headstrong woman with this radical sense of independence. So let's turn our attention now to Berthe Morisot. She was really the original woman French Impressionist. We can see her here in a photograph on the left and in a self-portrait from the mid-1880s over here. I love how loose her brushwork is, and we see just the suggestion of her brush and also this kind of swirling motion around her palette there. I think it's such a brilliant self-portrait. Now, Berthe Morisot also came from an upper middle class background, but she was French. And in France, women were not allowed to attend art school, but they could receive some art training from various teachers. And most people would go to somebody that they considered a master artist to receive this kind of training. And Berthe Morisot couldn't even go to the Louvre Museum to look at works of art from master artists without a chaperone. This is how limited their lives were. Now, she was, I said, the original woman Impressionist. She was there for that first exhibition and with the Impressionists for 7 out of their 8 shows. And I think she was slightly threatened when Marie Cassatt came around, but the two of them quickly became friends after they kind of got over the language barrier, and they would go out to eat together and write each other letters. This is a Marie Cassatt print over here, and a painting by Berthe Morisot. Now, what I found really interesting is that these two women artists also played the role of sort of peacemaker amongst the male Impressionists. They'd be leading up to a new exhibit, and the men would be quarreling with each other, and the women would help everybody find common ground. Now, it wasn't until they were in their middle age that Marie Cassatt and Berthe Morisot thought, let's try our hand at studying anatomy the same way that male artists were trained when they were young and in art school. So they hired a model to pose for them. They shared the same model. And these are kind of their first tentative attempts at painting the female nude. I say tentative because they're just painting naked backs here, really, for the most part. They're not even really sort of delving all the way into the subject of the female nude. But it's pretty amazing to me that these world-renowned, really, women painters had no experience studying anatomy until they were in their middle age, and that was only because of their gender. So how did Berthe Morisot become an artist? Well, she was in the circle of that artist, Edward Manet, that we started with, and he was so drawn to her. He thought of her as like a femme fatale. These are 3 paintings by Manet of Berthe Morisot. So she's already in his kind of social circle. And then Berthe Morisot marries Manet's brother, and that provided her with a lot of social and financial stability. So she didn't really need to paint, but she was determined to, in the same way that Marie Cassatt was. But the difference here is that Berthe Morisot gets married. Marie Cassatt does not. And she continues this very warm relationship with Edward Manet. Here is one other portrait of Berthe Morisot from Manet, and you can see he serves as an inspiration to her. This is a depiction of Morisot with a muff, and a few years later, she's painting another woman with a muff in a very similar pose, very similar palette. But once again, I love how animated her brushstrokes are. She's made it a fully Impressionist painting over here. So another difference between Morisot and Cassatt is that Morisot becomes a mother. She has a daughter named Julie. Julie is this beautiful child. We can see her here in the image on the right. And she's also an available model. So Morisot, I think 1/3 of her total artistic output are portraits of her daughter. And the image over here on the left is pretty amazing to think about, because this is her daughter Julie as a baby, and it's an image of a wet nurse feeding her daughter. So I think of this image as like the modern struggle for a woman professional. It's like, I'm trying to make art, I'm trying to make painting. There's not enough hours in the day for me to be a professional woman and a mother. So it's one woman staring at another woman down as they're dividing up these responsibilities. I don't think there's anything else like it in the history of art. It's pretty amazing that way. So some of Morisot's paintings, many of her paintings are about motherhood. And this is probably her most famous image. It's called The Cradle from 1872. It's at the Musée d'Orsay. This is a portrait of her sister, who was really another one of her available models, another female family member. And her sister had just given birth and is gazing down at the image of her infant, who is sleeping in this cradle here. And it's a very modern cradle, I should mention too, and a modern way to show a mother and daughter, because throughout the history of art, I mean, we've always seen these Madonnas and child images where the baby's sort of in her arms in some way. And there's a little bit of a distance here that's accentuated by this gauzy netting here. So as she's gazing down, I see a lot of ambivalence in this expression. Certainly there's love, but there's probably exhaustion there, and just like all of the uncertainty that comes with being a young new mother. But there's also a beautiful sense of connection where she is cradling her head in her hand and her elbow is bent on the edge of the crib. And you can see that the baby is echoing that same pose, and it's almost like their elbows are kissing in this moment. So it is a moment of connection, but it's an entirely modern view of motherhood. Now, another image where we see Morisot using her sister as a model is this one here. It's actually a slightly earlier picture where her sister is still pregnant, but she'd come to live with Morisot's mother during the pregnancy. So this is Morisot's mother, her sister over here. There's a pretty unbelievable story about this image. Apparently, Edward Manet, who is this, the male artist that had sort of brought Morisot into the fold here, he saw this picture, and he apparently picked up a brush too and started to alter it. And we know that he changed the way that Morisot had painted her mother. So we see a pretty high degree of detail in the way that she's painted her sister, but you'll notice that it's a completely different style in these very sort of thick brushstrokes that are used to describe the mother over here. And Morisot, we don't know her exact reaction to this, but we do know that she wrote in her notebook a little bit later on, "I don't think there has ever been a man who treated a woman as an equal, and that's all I would have asked for I know I'm as worthy as much as they." So I can imagine that this would have been a slightly insulting experience for a woman artist. So as she gets a little older, her brushwork gets looser. There is this wonderful exuberance in it. I think this is called Women in Gray from 1879. And I think she's really sort of like pushing the boundary here between like an unfinished and a finished work of art. But we see this sort of Rococo revival dress and this really sort of joyful woman, or at least a sense of joyfulness in the picture here, despite the gray color palette. Now, when it comes to an image like this, and really to Morisot's entire body of work, I just wanted to comment briefly about the way critics perceived this sort of thing. When they complimented Morisot, or even some of these other women impressionists, they would oftentimes compliment their feminine vision. And they'd use very different terms to describe their male counterparts. They would describe their work as original or having this kind of vigorous brushstroke. But whenever these works by women artists were considered inferior, it was always attributed to the fact that they were women. It was considered a weakness in their sex. So every critic always held in their mind that this was something that was created by someone who was an outsider. And certainly being a woman at this time made them an outsider. To wrap up on Morisot, we can see a portrait of her here by Auguste Renoir. She's in her 50s, and here's her daughter, Julie, just behind her. Now, sadly, Morisot passes away at the age of 54 from pneumonia. And she had become really disappointed in how her works were selling. She would actually give them really, she would price them way below market rate just to move them. And she only sold about 30 paintings during her entire career, whereas she made over 800 paintings in pastels and watercolors. When she passed away, unbelievably, on her death certificate, she was listed as a person with no profession, which is just really what a travesty, because she's clearly had so much talent. And her colleagues, the other Impressionists, really recognized this. They put together a retrospective of her career in the year following her death. And unbelievably, to this date, it remains the largest retrospective of her work that has ever been exhibited. So she is somebody who is due for a little bit of recognition. Now let's turn our attention to our next woman artist. This is Eva Gonzalez. She's a really interesting woman. She doesn't quite fit the mold of what we've seen so far. She's the youngest of all the women that we'll be looking at today. Here she is in a photograph, and there's that portrait of her by Edward Manet that we saw before. Like Cassatt and like Morisot, she came from a pretty wealthy background. She probably didn't have to have a career. And she was also, like them, kind of barred from going to museums and getting a formal training in the arts, at least in Paris. So what does she do? She actually breaks into the arts by way of modeling. She became a model for the artist Edward Manet, Morisot's brother-in-law. And that's how we see her in this painting here. But he recognizes her talent, and he takes her on as his first and only pupil. So that's a pretty special relationship there. And as I understand it, Morisot was a little bit jealous of it too. So here she is, a younger woman, a little bit of an outsider. Now, Eva Gonzalez, like her master, Edward Manet, doesn't really think of herself as an Impressionist and doesn't exhibit with the Impressionists. So she's a little bit of an outsider there. She's not necessarily considered a member of their circle, which is maybe why you haven't heard her name before. But she's brought into this sphere. And so I wanted to share with you a sample of her work here, and I think it will knock your socks off. I think this is such a gorgeous painting. It's called Une loge au théâtre italien. This is from 1874, so this is a couple of years before Cassatt was painting these opera paintings, and we can see that this is a riveting image, and there's a lot of influence from Manet here. So very quickly, I'm going to bring back the Olympia that we saw before, and we can see this stark contrast between the light and the dark with both of these images. You could even make the case that this bouquet here is a little bit of a reference to the bouquet that we see in Olympia. But let's go back and give this painting its full due. Now, just like the other artists that we've seen so far, Eva Gonzalez had to rely on female family members to serve as her model. So this is, in fact, her sister over here. And her sister is sitting in this opera box, framed up as though it's its own little theater. So she would be one of the wealthier people in this theater, and she would be a spectacle unto herself. And she's gorgeous. She's got this pale blue dress on, the colors echoed in the flowers. She's showing a lot of this pale flesh here. And in this moment, what is most likely happening is she's dropped her opera glasses from her face, and she's leaning forward onto this balustrade here, because she is totally engrossed in what's happening on the stage, presumably some sort of aria. She's moved. And for a split second, when you first see this work, it seems like she's looking right out at you. It's a very engaging work. I think she's actually kind of looking through you or looking past you, but there's a directness to this, which I think is so engaging and really kind of wonderful and refreshing. Now, what about this guy? She's there with a male companion, and he doesn't look at all interested in what's happening in this show. There seems to be this huge psychological distance between them. Incidentally, this is the man that Eva Gonzalez is going to marry. So it's her sister and her future husband here. And then just to make it like what a tangled web we weave, after Eva Gonzalez dies, her husband actually marries her sister. So this is this woman's future husband. But anyways, in this moment, they look like like they couldn't care less about each other, that they hardly know each other. So he might just be there as like a chaperone, and maybe he's even looking out the back door of the opera box in this moment. We don't really know why there's this disparity in terms of their engagement with the subject of the opera. But what we do know is that when it comes to the way women depict other women out in public spaces like this, they certainly give them more agency, a bit more suggestion of an intellectual engagement with what's happening on the stage. Whereas Renoir, as we saw earlier, gives us a woman who seems purely decorative. All right, so Eva Gonzalez paints women again and again throughout her body of work, sometimes in like the high-keyed kind of pastels that we associate with French Impressionism, and we see some real looseness in the brushwork over here. Sometimes we see a little bit of that darkness and realism that is more rooted in Monet and her training. This is a woman who works in a hat shop. This is a nanny over here who's also looking out directly at us. But for the most part, Eva Gonzalez was painting her sister again and again and again. Now, I showed this comparison to a friend of mine, and my friend said, oh, it's the same woman. She's wearing the same dress, and it's the same flowers. She's like, these pictures were probably painted on the same day. Now, they're actually separated by several years, and you can see a real shift in the way that Gonzalez is painting. We can see over on the left, it's all the influence from Monet. There's realism here. There's that harsh contrast from the bright white skin here and the dark background. But a few years later, it's a light, bright painting with a really loose brushwork that is much more in the Impressionist vein. What we see with, especially I think the image over here on the left, is this sense of the interior life perhaps of this woman. And like I said, both of these images are of her sister. Now, unfortunately, Eva Gonzalez's life is cut short pretty quickly. I mentioned she gets married. She gets married to somebody who's also in these artistic circles, and she gives birth. But sadly, she dies from an embolism right after her son was born. So she was just 34 years old when she passed away, really a life and a career that was cut short far too early. She died within 5 days of Edward Monet. And it is said that when she heard that her master passed away, she's on her deathbed and she sat right up and started to weave a garland of flowers for his grave. Now, once again, her contemporaries recognized that she had a special gift. And after she passed away, there was a 90-piece retrospective of her work in Paris. And I'm sure since then, it's been hard to bring all these paintings back together again. But she is better recognized these days, more often recognized these days. But of course, it's a much smaller body of work because she lived for such a short time. But she's certainly recognized for the subtle emotion that she captured and the rich detail as well. So we're going to finish up with our last artist in our last few minutes, and that is Marie Bracquemond, who's really an outsider in an outsider's game here. So she's already an outsider because she's a woman, but she doesn't quite fit in with these other women, primarily because Marie Bracquemond did not come from a well-to-do background. We see her in a self-portrait over here. This is from 1870, and then a photograph from about 16 years later. Now, she has all of the obstacles that the other women faced, in addition to the fact that she can't afford much. So she can't go to the Louvre. She can get some training. And amazingly, she actually comes under the tutelage of a preeminent painter who was kind of way past his prime. The artist who begins as her teacher is the artist Ingres, and he was a neoclassical painter, but he was really kind of popular in the 1830s. And at this point in the 1870s, he was like a scary old man to her. So this is his self-portrait from about 10 years before that. And here is an etching that Marie Bracquemond made of another female art student, but I think it kind of gives us an insight into what it was like for her. She was considered one of the smartest pupils that he took on, but she said, well, she wrote, "I must admit, Monsieur Ingres' severity frightened me. He thinks a woman lacks the drive and perseverance required by painting and wants to set limits for her, granting her only the painting of flowers, fruit, and still lifes." So she didn't like that either. That sort of reminds me of Mary Cassatt at the Pennsylvania Academy of Arts. So she comes out from underneath him eventually and really, finds tremendous success early on. She has a work that is accepted into the Paris Salon, that big annual state-sponsored exhibition. And then she starts to get commissions from the court of Napoleon III. And then the director of the Louvre Museum actually hires her to start making copies of important paintings in the collection. So everything's going well for Marie Bracquemond. And what's more, while she's working in the Louvre, she meets a man. This is probably why they wanted young women to have chaperones, because I guess there's a lot of courting that's going on. She meets a man who becomes her husband. This is Felix Bracquemond, in a portrait painted by Marie Bracquemond. And he was also in artistic circles. He was an etcher. And so this is an etching that he created of Marie Bracquemond creating a painting. So they connected immediately. Not just romantically, but artistically. They're really interested in what the other is doing. But unfortunately, it turns out that Felix Bracquemond hated Impressionism, and it becomes a real sticking point in their relationship. And what's more, it turns out that he wasn't really a nice guy. In fact, a family friend who is also an art critic once described him as a terrible master, both argumentative and authoritarian, and he was unwilling to cede any point. His temper disproportionately affected Marie. When she tried to appease him, he would reply, "Your sweetness crucifies me." So what a relationship that is. And so, like Berthe Morisot, Marie Bracquemond gives birth. She's negotiating all of these things, becoming a professional artist, being a mother, being a wife. This is her portrait of her son, Pierre, when he was just 5, and then about 12 years later, when he's about 17. And you can see she's moved from realism to full-blown Impressionism by this point. And there's a real closeness between her and her son. Notice too that he is making art at this young age as well. Now, I wanted to show you a few paintings by Marie Bracquemond, and I wish that when we talked about Impressionism in general, this was the painting that came to everybody's mind. I think this painting is just a knockout. So what we're looking at is a picture that Marie Bracquemond painted on her back terrace. It's called On the Terrace. And I should mention, she really never left her house. She couldn't go out like Edgar Degas. So she really only painted inside and outside of her own house. And like the other women artists that we saw before, it was her sister who was her model again and again and again. So what's so great about this painting? Well, first of all, we see the wonderful broken visible brushstrokes of French Impressionism, particularly in the garden landscape surrounding these 3 figures. And then we have these huge figures in front of us, and there is so much uncertainty in terms of what is going on here. They're all looking in different directions. You feel like you've actually just walked into a space where these 3 people were talking about you, and they just became aware of your presence, and they're all looking away sort of sheepishly. So there's this physical intimacy here, but it seems as though there's a psychological distance. So let's start with this lovely lady in white. She is resting her head on her hand, and she seems like she's got maybe some embroidery in her lap. I mean, she is in a world all her own. Notice how the light sort of comes through her hat here. I mean, French Impressionism is all about this play of light and shadow. Bracquemond is expert at capturing that. Just behind her is this man whose chin is lifted and he's gazing off into the distance. He's a world away as well. Notice that his arm is resting on the bench where this woman in white is sitting. And then finally, there is this figure over here on the left, and I just love her. She is peering out directly at us. It's like your heart sort of stops when you see her. She is like inspecting us. And there's a directness and an engagement here that you don't often see in painting from this time. Now she's got this veil, this gauzy veil over her eyes, but she's just lowered this little eyepiece here too. And she's resting her hands very matter-of-factly, on that parasol there. So you get the sense that she's got something to say. This is really interesting. There's a directness, again, that sort of reminds me of Eva Gonzalez and the opera box at the Italian theater. But this figure sort of looking through us, or maybe beyond us, this figure is really, really looking right at us. And of course, this is painted in that full Impressionist style. Now, Marie Bracquemond painted her sister again and again on that same garden terrace. And it was often that we would see women Impressionists showing other women reading. Mary Cassatt has a lot of depictions of women reading too. So women taking part in things that that they're intellectually engaged with is another kind of signature for women Impressionists. In this moment, she does seem a little distracted from her book, but there's also the lovely still life here as well. One last painting by Marie Bracquemond, and what a painting it is. This is also at the Musée d'Orsay. It's from 1880, and it's known as Three Women with Parasols, or the Three Graces. So this is a self-portrait of the artist at the center. Look at, again, at how she plays with light on the edges of all of these women's dresses, even in the part in her hair here. And there's still kind of fascinating plays with these glances too. It goes back to like the flaneur and the power of the male gaze. Both of the women flanking her were both, they're both her sister, her sister modeled for both of those women. And there's a directness here that's wonderful, but the brushwork is also loose and very sort of liberated here. It's a gorgeous image, this beautiful color palette. And it's one that we don't see nearly enough of when we're learning about French Impressionism. So whatever happened to Marie Bracquemond? Here we see her in a self-portrait from 1888. Just 2 years later, she's going to give up painting altogether. And it's really because her husband was just so resentful of her career, and especially of French Impressionism. He just detested it. She would advocate for it for years to come, but she always felt this sense of like this bitter disappointment that she couldn't be more successful as a professional artist. Now, her son was a defender of hers right up until her death, and even beyond. He wrote a little biography of his mother, and then he was the one that put together a retrospective of her work after she passed away in 1916. So a couple of big ideas to finish up with tonight. The first is that we have this sense that male Impressionist artists often depicted women as objects, not as subjects. And when it comes to women Impressionists, they're giving us more of a sensitive and intimate look at the lives of women during this period of art in the late 19th century. And as Mary Cassatt had advocated, women should be someone and not something. And I think that's what we see these artists doing in their work. Now, they were painting women by necessity. These were the options that were available, but they were leaning on these relationships that they had with the women in their lives, with their mothers and daughters and sisters. These were the available models for them. Now, their work is always in dialogue with their male counterparts, but I think what we have to keep in mind as we make those comparisons is that these women artists were up against so much more than their male counterparts. There were the barriers to education, the societal restrictions on where they could go and what they could do, and then this idea that there's these women negotiating motherhood and marriage, and all of the misogyny from the press and from their teachers. There was so much that they had to push back against. So becoming a woman Impressionist really required a great deal of courage and a great deal of persistence. In the words of Mary Cassatt, who outlived all of these women, she said, "I have not done what I wanted to do, but I tried to make a good fight." And I hope we can all come away from today's program with an appreciation for the fight that exists in these works. Even though they're soft and they're sweet and they're beautiful, there is that toughness in the women Impressionists. So I will end it there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments that you have about Mary Cassatt or the other artists we looked at. I'm looking at the comments here. Frank, thank you. And Rosamund. Karen says, Bracquemond's work was unknown to me, but it definitely affected me. Oh, I love hearing that. It is really spectacular, isn't it? It's sort of a showstopper. There was a great art historian sort of in the first half of the 20th century that said there were three great ladies of the Impressionist movement. And he said, and so it's always been believed that that was the way, it was Cassat, Morisot, and Bracquemond. Eva Gonzalez was left out of that. So Bracquemond is maybe more familiar to some, but she doesn't get nearly enough credit, I would say. Let's see, Dan says, oh, thank you so much, Dan, for your kind words, making me appreciate all of these painters. I really appreciate that. Thank you, everybody, for your kind words. That really means so much to me. We all have the chance to get together again next month. I believe the talk is on April 27th, and we will be looking at the work of Marc Chagall. And it's so joyful. It's going to be such a great time. And I'm just seeing another comment in the chat here, which is, in the Q&A, and that is another nice comment. So I appreciate all of the nice comments. Thank you, everybody. And I know in doing the research for this, it definitely made me think of Mary Cassatt in a whole new light. So hopefully a lot of you are thinking of her in a new way as well. When I first was thinking about putting this program together, I was like, oh, I can't just do Mary Cassatt because we can't just look at women and babies for a whole hour. But I love that we were able to look at sort of the bigger picture with her because she was a pretty fierce lady.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Jane, as always, such a great presentation. Always enjoy doing them. So thank you so much for being here. And yes, thank you, Jane, for bringing up next month's program. So everyone, please be on the lookout for all of the upcoming Art on Thursdays. And you can find all of that on our events page on the library website. And of course, if you have any questions, need help registering, please contact us at the reference desk. We'd be more than happy to help you out. So again, thank you everyone so much for coming tonight. And Jane, thanks again.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, everybody. Have a great
All right. Have a good night.